A police officer hit Ronda Rousey with a baton, but after a second realized he had messed with the wrong person. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what city you are from. The late afternoon sun bathed the park in a soft golden hue, its rays filtering through the dense canopy of oak and maple trees. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers, blending with the distant laughter of children and the rhythmic chirping of birds. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, offering brief moments of relief from the warmth of the summer day. Joggers padded along the winding trails, their footsteps steady and familiar against the paved paths. Families sprawled on blankets, sharing sandwiches and stories, while a group of teenagers played catch near the playground. Their joyous shouts rose above the ambient hum of the park's serenity. Dogs barked playfully as they chased after frisbees, and the occasional cyclist rang their bell, weaving through the meandering paths with ease. Near a large weathered oak tree stood an old wooden bench, its paint worn from years of sun and rain. Upon it sat a lone woman, her presence unobtrusive, yet quietly commanding. She appeared to be part of the park itself, calm, natural, and rooted. Her posture was relaxed, one arm resting casually along the back of the bench, the other holding a small protein bar, which she slowly broke into pieces and scattered at her feet. A cluster of pigeons eagerly pecked at the crumbs, their heads bobbing in rhythmic hunger. She watched them with a quiet meditative stillness, her lips pressed into a neutral line, neither smiling nor frowning. Ronda J. Rousey. There was a raw, elemental power within her stillness, the kind forged through years of battle, discipline, and pain. Her body, clad in black athletic leggings and a simple gray hoodie, was the sculpted product of a lifetime of combat sports. Her blonde hair, pulled back into a tight ponytail, framed a face marked by determination, angular cheekbones, piercing eyes, and a jawline that spoke of resolve. She radiated the kind of calm that only came from someone who had faced storms and learned to stand unmoved within them. But beneath the surface, there was something more. A tether wound tightly within her, a dormant force waiting, though it did not seek a reason to surface. She was here, not as a fighter, but as a person at rest, a woman enjoying a rare moment of peace with no opponent, no cameras, and no crowd. The pigeons flapped and scattered briefly as the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps broke the park's natural symphony. The cadence of the stride was authoritative, sharp, and unhurried, cutting through the soft ambience like a blade. The thud of polished boots against pavement was the sound of someone who expected to be noticed and obeyed. The presence of the man carrying those steps was felt before he was seen. Officer Brent Carlisle, a towering figure in a meticulously pressed LAPD uniform. Carlisle moved through the park like a wolf surveying its territory. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the world around him in cold, impersonal fragments, concealing his sharp, appraising eyes beneath them. His utility belt, loaded with the polished instruments of his authority, a baton, handcuffs, taser, and standard-issue firearm, clinked faintly with each step, an audible reminder of his power. His face, square-jawed and set in a hard, professional mask, carried the expression of a man who had long learned that the world responded to force and dominance. Carlisle was not known for his patience or kindness. He enjoyed his authority, not as a duty, but as a weapon, one he wielded with the comfort of practice and without the burden of conscience. Over the years, the people who frequented this part of the city had learned that challenging him brought swift consequences. Most had adapted to the survival strategy of quiet compliance. Those who didn't rarely forgot their mistake. As he patrolled the park, his eyes hidden but watchful, he scanned over the crowds with silent judgment. He registered the joggers, the dog walkers, the couples, all filed and categorized within his mental landscape as harmless. Then his gaze landed on the woman, sitting alone on the bench. Something about her struck him as wrong. She wasn't doing anything unlawful, but it was the way she occupied the space, too self-contained. She wasn't running, picnicking, or walking a dog. She was simply sitting, and Carlisle disliked stillness without purpose. In his experience, people who lingered alone in public spaces were either loiterers or troublemakers, sometimes both. His lips curled slightly in quiet disdain. He had encountered types like her before, People who carried themselves with a stubborn self-assurance, as though authority were something that applied only to others. They were the kind who challenged, who resisted, and who believed they didn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else. Carlyle enjoyed correcting those kinds of people. It was, in his eyes, a public service. Veering off the main path, he altered his course directly toward the bench. His boots struck the ground with deliberate purpose, the kind of stride that announced his presence before his voice ever needed to. As he closed the distance, his fingers rushed against the handle of his baton, a familiar, comforting presence at his side. He didn't expect trouble, but he always welcomed an excuse to assert his authority if it came. The world around them continued its peaceful rhythms. A woman walking her dog slowed briefly, her eyes flicking between the officer and the solitary woman on the bench, sensing something just beneath the surface. A group of young men playing catch exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the prelude to a confrontation. They had seen Officer Carlyle at work before. The officer came to a halt, his imposing shadow falling over Ronda. He stood with his feet planted wide, his hands resting on his belt, exuding the calculated aura of authority that demanded immediate compliance. The pigeons scattered at his arrival, their wings flapping loudly as they fled, the tension that even they could feel. Ronda remained as she was. She did not tense, nor did she shift or acknowledge the officer's arrival. Her posture remained as steady in composure. The sun, partially blocked by his towering frame, cast half of her face in soft shadow beneath the brim of her hoodie. A flicker of irritation sparked beneath Carlyle's professional mask. He was accustomed to people adjusting themselves immediately in his presence, nervous shifts, quick explanations, submissive compliance. But this woman did nothing. No recognition, no apology, no obedience. The air between them thickened, the surrounding sounds of the park seeming to muffle under the invisible pressure of the moment. Time for a breath felt suspended. Carlyle inhaled slowly, his nostrils flaring as he suppressed a wave of impatience already rising beneath his skin. This was the part where most people realized who they were dealing with and responded accordingly. But the woman remained precisely as she was, as if his presence meant nothing. The quiet, he decided, would not last. The officer shifted his stance slightly, his polished boots grinding subtly against the pavement. The fingers of his right hand flexed once, brushing the baton handle, a habitual movement born from anticipation rather than need. He didn't enjoy escalating situations without cause, but he never hesitated when a cause presented itself. The sun's descent continued, shadows lengthening inch by inch. The golden warmth of the day slowly gave way to the edge of approaching twilight. Yet within the small circle where they stood, one seated, one standing, the air felt charged, heavy with something unseen but inevitable. The park, oblivious to the gathering storm within it, continued its gentle symphony. Children laughed, birds chirped, and leaves rustled in the warm summer breeze. But those closest, those who had paused their walks and conversations, felt it. That subtle shift in the air, the crackle before the lightning, the stillness before the thunder. And so, beneath the waning sun, the first silent chord of confrontation was struck. The park watched. The earth held its breath, and the air grew thick with the promise that something once started could never be undone. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the park's winding paths. The air, warm and thick with the scent of summer grass, seemed to slow, as if the earth itself sensed a change in atmosphere. The background hum of distant laughter and soft conversations felt dulled, as if nature itself held its breath. Yet within the expanse, in silence, tension gathered. A taut, invisible thread stretched between two figures, the seated woman and the standing officer. Carlyle's patience, a thin and brittle veneer at the best of times, cracked. The refusal of this woman to acknowledge his presence, to submit to the silent authority he carried with his uniform, gnawed at him like a splinter under the skin. In his world, people responded. They flinched, they apologized, they obeyed. But this woman remained still, exuding a calm so absolute it felt like defiance. He stepped closer, his boots striking the pavement with sharp finality. A faint scuffing sound accompanied the movement, the whisper of polished leather meeting stone. His shadow deepened, fully eclipsing the seated figure. Still, she did not move. The silence felt unbearable. Carlyle's voice, when it came, was clipped and cold, sharp enough to cut through the ambient sounds of the park. It carried the practiced edge of a man who had spent years ensuring his words commanded attention and compliance. He expected her to respond, to offer the usual nervous excuses or empty apologies that came from those caught beneath the crushing weight of authority. But there was no answer, not a flinch, not a glance. The only visible sign of his growing agitation was a muscle in his jaw tightening. The woman's stillness felt less like ignorance and more like dismissal, and that was something he could not tolerate. Carlyle had built his authority on a foundation of reaction. People yielded to his voice, his posture, his badge. It was not simply a matter of enforcing the law. It was about maintaining control. And control, he knew, was established in moments exactly like this, when defiance met force, and force prevailed. He felt the familiar warmth of adrenaline seep into his veins, a slow, simmering heat beneath his skin. His hand, seemingly of its own volition, brushed the baton at his side. The cool, textured grip was a reassuring anchor. His voice, low and edged with warning, cut through the shrinking distance between them. Still no response. His irritation sharpened into something colder, something that scraped against his ribs and coiled in his chest. This wasn't defiance, it was indifference. And in his world, indifference was a challenge. Without another word, he moved. The baton swung, swift and sudden, arcing downward in a sharp, controlled strike aimed for her shoulder. Not meant to maim, but to correct, to punish, to remind. The polished black shaft sliced through the air with a faint, deadly whisper. But it meant nothing. At the last possible moment, the woman shifted, not with haste, not with panic, but with the effortless grace of someone who had moved with violence their entire life. The baton passed within an inch of her form, and the bench trembled beneath the force of the impact, a sharp crack splintering the air. Carlyle's eyes flashed with confusion. His strike, fast and direct, had met only wood. His mind registered the miss, but his body, fueled by instinct and pride, pressed forward. He twisted his wrist, redirecting the baton into a backhanded arc, aiming lower for the side of her torso. But the second blow never landed. The woman's arm rose, smooth and effortless, and the baton halted mid-swing, arrested in her grip. Her hand, strong and steady, closed around the weapon's shaft with the ease of someone seizing a passing branch. Carlyle felt the impact, not in resistance, but in stillness. Absolute, immovable, and complete. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to pause. The grip was solid, too solid. The strength he felt in her fingers, clamped over his baton, was wrong. Too controlled, too effortless. The air between them thickened with something primal, a current that needed no words to convey its message. You have made a mistake. Carlyle's instinct screamed at him to pull back, to regain distance, to reassess. But pride moved his muscles before reason could reach them. He yanked hard, intending to rip the baton from her grasp. But the baton did not move. Instead, she did. Her arm twisted, not violently, but with precise, mechanical intent. Carlyle felt his wrist turn unnaturally, the tendons protesting as the weapon rotated under her control. He had a moment, a brief, fleeting instant, where his body told him he had lost this exchange. The baton slipped free from his fingers, not torn, not wrenched, simply taken. The polished shaft hit the ground between them with a sharp, ringing clatter, rolling once before coming to rest against the pavement. The silence that followed was a living thing. The small audience that had gathered, a woman with a dog, a pair of young men, a couple walking hand in hand, stood frozen, their eyes wide. Some had already raised their phones, the glowing screens capturing the impossible moment. Carlyle's breath sharpened, his chest rising and falling in a sudden, clipped rhythm. His arm tingled from the sudden, unfamiliar loss of leverage. But more than the physical, it was the implication that landed heavy in his chest. He had moved first. He had struck first. And he had failed. The woman, still seated, did not speak. She did not rise. She did not advance. She simply released the baton from her grasp, letting it fall as if discarding something unnecessary, something beneath her notice. Carlyle's ears burned. The pulse in his neck thudded in a hard, pounding rhythm. He felt the heat of eyes on him, witnesses. Shame crawled hot and venomous beneath his skin. This was not how it was supposed to go. He squared his stance, his body taut, his pride raw and wounded. He felt the crowd watching, waiting for his response, his authority. His control now dangled on a fragile thread, and he knew only one way to seize it back. The baton may have fallen, but his belt held another answer. His fingers twitched once, brushing the cold, familiar weight of his service weapon. And for the first time since the confrontation began, a flicker of uncertainty passed through his chest. The woman had not run, had not flinched, had not struck. Yet the air felt charged. A moment pregnant with consequence. The kind of moment that splits a life into before and after. The ground beneath his feet felt unsteady. The path ahead of him blurred by the haze of adrenaline and pride. The laughter of children echoed distantly, unaware of the line that had just been crossed. And though no word had been spoken, the woman's silence screamed louder than any warning. The storm was no longer coming. It was already here. The world around them felt like it had paused. The warm summer air, once filled with the soft symphony of the park's life, laughter, footsteps, birdsong, was now muffled under the weight of something colder, something raw and electric. All the brightness of the day seemed to drain into the widening gulf between the seated woman and the uniformed man. The sharp clatter of the fallen baton still echoed in the air, but it was the silence that came after that carried the heaviest blow. Carlyle stood rigid, his chest rising and falling, his breath clipped and uneven. His wrist throbbed, the nerves still singing from the brief, absolute grip that had disarmed him. It wasn't pain that burned in his veins, but humiliation. The eyes. The phones were on him. He felt their judgment, like a brand searing into his skin. His authority, his power, had been undercut, and it had happened in front of witnesses. Worse, it had been done without a word, without a blow, without a single show of force beyond the kind that could not be taught, only earned. The woman hadn't even stood up. The blood in Carlyle's ears pounded so loudly he could barely hear the murmurs now rising from the small gathering crowd. But he saw their faces, saw the glint of phone cameras capturing every second of his failure. And beneath the heat of his wounded pride, something cold and sharp twisted in his gut. He couldn't let it end like this, without thinking, without deciding. His hand moved, instinct fueled by years of training and hardened by a hunger to reclaim control. It drove his fingers toward his belt. His palm found the holster, his thumb flicking the strap free with a mechanical snap. The weight of the firearm, cold and familiar, pressed into his hand, offering him the answer. But he never completed the draw. Her hand was already on him. She moved like water, smooth and unhurried, as if the air itself parted to clear her path. His wrist, his gun hand, was caught in an unyielding grasp, firm, precise, and controlled, with the economy of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering violence. His muscles locked in a reflexive resistance, but it was too late. His grip, once so certain, began to slip. The firearm, the ultimate symbol of his power, was no longer his. She didn't wrench it away. She didn't tear or twist. She simply took it. 1 second it was his, the next it wasn't, and then it was gone. The gun, heavy with potential destruction, now rested effortlessly in her callous palm. She didn't raise it. She didn't point it. She merely held it, turning it slightly, examining its weight with the idle curiosity of someone who didn't need it. The silence around them deepened into something unnatural. The murmur of the crowd faltered, replaced by an almost collective intake of breath, a sharp, fragile stillness as the scales of power tipped and shattered. Carlyle felt the shape of his failure as clearly as the shape of the weapon he no longer held. His body, rigid with adrenaline and confusion, screamed for action, for retaliation, for something to break the unbearable moment where he stood stripped of his power, his tools, and his control. But she didn't move. She didn't threaten. She didn't speak. With deliberate slowness, she bent her knees, lowered the weapon, and placed it on the ground beside the fallen baton. The metal met the pavement with a soft, anticlimactic clink. Then she straightened and resumed her seat, as if nothing had happened, as if this was nothing more than a passing inconvenience, as if he, the officer, the man with the badge, the belt, and the authority, was irrelevant. The crowd's murmurs returned, swelling into something heavier, something buzzing with disbelief. More phones were out now, screens capturing his disgrace from every angle. Someone whispered, someone chuckled, and Carlyle felt something in his chest snap. This wasn't defiance. It was dismissal, and that he could not accept. The sharp, burning heat of his pride flooded through his limbs, scorching over the warning instincts that clawed at the edges of his reason. His body moved before his mind could stop it. He surged forward, raw, reckless, and burning with the need to reassert what had been stripped from him. It was a charge, unguarded, uncalculated, driven by nothing but fury and desperation. But desperation has no discipline, and the woman met his chaos with absolute precision. There was no strike, no punch, no kick, just a shift. Her body flowed, and his forward momentum met an iron force wrapped in velvet grace. His wrist, the same wrist that had lost the baton, the gun, and now control, was taken again. Not seized, not twisted, redirected. His balance vanished. His feet, once planted with authority, left the earth. The sky, brilliant and blue, filled his vision, and for a brief, breathless moment, he felt weightless. Then the earth found him. The impact was sudden, but it was not violence. It was inevitability. His back met the pavement with a hollow, decisive thump that echoed far louder in his pride than in his bones. The air fled his lungs in a sharp, shuddering gasp, and for a moment the world blurred at the edges. Then he lay still. The crowd around him swelled into something else entirely. Not just surprise, but recognition. The crowd had not witnessed a fight. They had witnessed a lesson. Carlyle's chest heaved. His body, burning with the insult of being reduced, dismantled without injury, without effort, without acknowledgement. Above him, the woman, still seated, still composed, watched without judgment. There was no triumph in her gaze, no cruelty, no satisfaction, only the still waiting patience of someone who had been here before. And in that gaze, he felt something colder than any humiliation. She had held back. Carlyle felt his fists clench against the pavement, his nails biting into his palms as the inferno of his failure consumed him. The tension in his chest was unbearable, too heavy, too sharp, too public. The phones were still on him, the faces, the eyes, the judgment. But worse was the silence. The woman didn't need to speak. The world had already heard her loud and clear. But Carlyle, drowning in the fire of his own collapse, refused to be ended this way. He wouldn't allow it. The anger, the pride, the authority, they screamed for an answer, for a conclusion. And his hand, shaken but determined, began to move. The gun lay discarded, the baton forgotten. But his belt held more than weapons. It held his voice. His fingers closed over the cold metallic curve of his radio, and he pressed the button. Officer needs assistance. Immediate backup. His voice, ragged and tight with anger, cut through the silence. The tension in the air shifted instantly. The primal electricity snapped into something new, something heavier. The eyes in the crowd, wide and uncertain, flicked to one another. The woman's expression, for the first time, changed. Not fear, not worry, but something colder, something that said you've made your choice. And the distant hum of approaching sirens, faint but growing, began to sing the next verse of the unfolding disaster. The distant wail of sirens threaded through the summer air, a thin, rising note of tension that promised swift consequences. The park, once a place of careless joy, now felt taut and watchful, its natural rhythms disrupted by the undercurrent of conflict. People who had paused to observe the unfolding scene no longer wore expressions of idle curiosity. They watched with bated breath, eyes flicking between the woman and the man on the pavement. They sensed the shift, the way the confrontation had outgrown the small stage of a park bench and spilled into something more dangerous. Carlyle felt the pavement beneath him, rough and hot from the day's sun, pressing into his back through the fabric of his uniform. His chest heaved, dragging an air that felt thick and heavy. His pride burned hotter than his bruised body. His fingers still clenched around the radio, the sharp edges of the device digging into his palm as if to anchor him. The distant sirens, growing clearer with every second, were a bomb and a curse. Backup meant witnesses, more eyes, more judgment, but it also meant an opportunity to reclaim control, to rewrite the narrative, to emerge not as the officer who had been disarmed and thrown, but as the one who had subdued a threat. The woman had not moved. She remained seated, the same figure of unshakable composure she had been from the beginning. Her stillness, so effortless, felt like an accusation. She had shown neither aggression nor apology, offering nothing for him to leverage. He was not resisting, and yet he had lost. And now, with the sirens closing in, he saw his final chance to shift the tide. His body screamed with tension as he rolled to his side and pushed himself to his knees. The crowd's murmurs pricked at his ears, a soft, uncertain chorus. They were waiting for what would come next. His hand hovered near his belt. The familiar weight of his service weapon was absent, leaving his fingers empty and his power hollow. But he would not be powerless, not here, not now. His voice, sharp and edged with the strain of his wounded pride, sliced through the thick air. Down on the ground now. His command was hard, absolute, a last attempt to frame the story on his terms. It did not matter that the woman had made no move against him. It did not matter that it was he who had struck first, he who had escalated. Authority was not about truth. It was about control. The woman's eyes, cold and clear as a winter sky, met his. There was something in them that froze him deeper than any refusal, an unspoken question. Is this truly the path you choose? She did not lower herself. She did not rise either. She simply remained existing in a space beyond his authority. The sirens arrived, and with them the sharp screech of tires against pavement. A patrol car rolled to a halt on the grass, its lights painting the park with frantic pulses of red and blue. 2 doors opened in near unison, and from them emerged 2 more officers. One was young, taut with alertness, the other older, seasoned, his face lined with years of decisions made and consequences borne. The older officer, his hand resting near his belt but not on his weapon, took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. His gaze landed on Carlyle, disheveled and humiliated, his hand twitching near his hip. Then on the woman, still and unthreatening. Then finally, on the scattered weapons, the baton, the firearm discarded like relics of a story already told. The younger officer, eager and tense, moved to action, his voice rising. "Ma'am, hands where we can see them." But the older officer's hand, firm and certain, halted his partner's advance. "Wait," he said, his voice low but carrying the authority only experience can forge. His eyes narrowed slightly, the gears of understanding turning behind them. He had seen violence. He had seen resistance. This was neither. This was something different. Carlyle, feeling the crumbling of his control, seized the moment with both hands. He pointed a shaking finger toward the woman, his voice raw and desperate. She assaulted an officer. The words, sharp and loud, were meant to fill the space where his authority had fractured. But the older officer, his eyes never leaving the seated woman, spoke one word. "No." The single syllable fell like a hammer, shattering the fragile framework Carlyle had tried to build. His face twisted, flushed with anger and something dangerously close to fear. "What do you mean, no?" "You saw." "I saw," the senior officer interrupted, his tone even, his gaze heavy. "I saw everything I needed to." His eyes flicked once more to the discarded gun, then back to the woman. There was something in his expression, a flicker of recognition, not just of what she had done, but who she was. Carlyle felt the world shift beneath him. His heart pounded, his body vibrating with the electric urge to fight, to claw back what he felt slipping through his fingers. The eyes of the crowd, the judgment of his peers, the sear and heat of his own failure. They all pressed against him, suffocating, inescapable. His hand, trembling with the need to act, began to rise. The older officer's voice, calm but unmistakably final, cut through the tension. "That's enough." The sirens, the whispers, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Carlyle's voice, hoarse with fury, broke the silence. "That's enough," the senior officer repeated, still beneath his calm. "Stand down, Carlyle." But Carlyle, his pride a raw wound, his shame a burning pit, felt the last thin thread of his restraint snap. His voice, shaken, became a demand. The use of his first name, low and steady, hit harder than any shouted order. It carried no rank, no command, only the weight of someone who saw, truly saw, and had already judged him. Carlyle, his body rigid, his heart pounding, knew that he had lost more than a fight. He had lost the ground beneath his feet, and no act of force would reclaim it. The senior officer's next words fell with the finality of a closing door. "Give me your badge." The park, the world, seemed to narrow to a single point, the unbearable silence that swallowed everything in the wake of those 4 words. Carlyle's face, flushed and burning, froze. Shock, disbelief, and something rawer than either sliced through his chest. His lips parted, but no sound came. The older officer's eyes, steady and cold, did not waver. Badge and gun. The command was absolute, but the judgment had already been made. Carlyle's hand, stiff and trembling, rose to his chest. His fingers, numb and foreign, found the cold curve of the shield that had defined him. The weight of it, once a symbol of power, now felt like an anchor dragging him down. For a breath, one long, endless breath, he hesitated, but there was nothing left to fight for. No authority, no power, no story to tell. With a motion that felt like breaking, he unpinned the badge. The metal glinted briefly in the fractured light, a dying ember. It hit the older officer's palm with a final, hollow sound. The gun followed. Its weight surrendered without a fight. The world, as it always does, moved on. The wind rustled the leaves. A child's laughter, distant and pure, echoed somewhere beyond the trees, and the sun, descending toward the horizon, threw long shadows across the broken remains of pride and power. The older officer, his face hard but not unkind, gave a short nod. "Go home, Dad." Carlyle, stripped of everything but the crushing weight of himself, turned and walked away. The park seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding. As Carlyle, his steps heavy with the ruin of his authority, began to walk away, his boots struck the pavement, but they no longer carried the weight of command. Without the badge, without the gun, his uniform felt like a costume, a hollow shell that no longer belonged to him. The warm summer breeze, which had once carried the soft joy of children's laughter and the whisper of leaves, now felt cool against his burning skin, a silent witness to his disgrace. The eyes of the crowd followed him, some wide with disbelief, others narrowed with judgment, but the worst were the ones with phones still raised, their screens capturing every painful second. He could already feel it. This moment would not stay confined to the park. It would spread, carried by likes, shares, and comments, until it became something larger than his failure. It would become a spectacle. His stomach knotted at the thought of it. A lifetime of authority, of power, reduced to a viral clip that the world would dissect and mock. Yet it wasn't the cameras that scorched his pride the deepest. It was her. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't struck him, hadn't threatened, but she had undone him all the same, stripping him of every layer of control until only the raw, ugly truth remained. And the truth was that he had brought himself to ruin, step by step, driven by the need to dominate someone who had never needed power to be powerful. The senior officer, his face carved from experience and disappointment, watched Carlyle's retreat without satisfaction. His hand, still clutching the surrendered badge and weapon, felt their weight differently than before. It was not victory he held, but consequence, heavy, cold, and inevitable. With a glance, he gave a subtle nod to the younger officer, who moved toward the seated woman. But there was no aggression in his steps, no tension in his shoulders. There was only caution, the kind born from knowing you were in the presence of something you did not fully understand. The woman, still seated, turned her eyes toward him. She made no move to rise, no shift that could be read as hostility. Yet, in her stillness, he felt something unmistakable, the presence of someone who could end a fight before it began. He stopped a few paces away, his voice measured and even. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman's eyes, steady and sharp, held his for a beat. Then, with the same composure she had carried through the entire ordeal, she dipped her chin once, a silent acknowledgement. Nothing more. The officer's hand, which had hovered cautiously near his belt, eased back to his side. There would be no need for force here. There never had been. "Would you be willing to stay a moment and make a statement?" His tone was respectful, not a command, but a request. The woman, her expression unreadable, shifted her gaze briefly to the fallen Baton and the discarded firearm, then back to the officer. For a moment, it seemed she would refuse. But then, without a word, she stood. The movement, fluid and controlled, seemed to lift the invisible tension from the air. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to disperse. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and the ever-present glow of phone screens dimmed. A few lingered, their curiosity tethered by the gravity of what they had witnessed. But the spectacle, the fire that had drawn their attention, was dying to embers. Carlyle's retreat carried him past them, but he did not hear their whispers. His ears roared with the pounding of his own heart, his mind circling the event with desperate, burning disbelief. His fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms as if pain could anchor him against the unraveling of his world. His mouth tasted of copper. His lip, he realized distantly, had split when he hit the ground. A voice from behind broke into his storm. Dan, the weight of his name, stripped of rank, halted his steps. He turned stiffly to face the senior officer, his face a battlefield of pride and bitterness. The older man held his gaze, and in his eyes, Carlyle saw neither triumph nor sympathy, only the sober gravity of a man who had seen this fall before. "You need to go home." The words were soft, but they carried the weight of finality. Carlyle's chest heaved with something close to rage, but it found no place to land. There was no enemy here but himself. His voice, when it came, was raw. "This isn't." "It is," the senior officer interrupted. The certainty in his voice cut through any protest. "It's over." The truth of it hit harder than any blow. His jaw worked, his teeth grinding against the bitter taste of defeat. For a moment, he stood there, a man stripped of everything but his anger and his shame. Then, with a sharp, ragged breath, he turned and walked away. His shadow stretched long and hollow behind him. The park, in its indifference, welcomed the return of its peace. The children's laughter, the soft murmur of leaves, the gentle patter of footsteps on gravel, all resumed their place in the natural order. But something had shifted, something unseen but felt. The earth holds memory, and the ground beneath the old oak would remember this day as one where power had been tested and found wanting. The woman, her face composed but her eyes still guarded, spoke for the first time. Her voice, low but firm, carried, "No charges. He's had enough." The senior officer studied her, the hard lines of his face softening for a fleeting second with something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps understanding. "Understood." She gave him a nod. Without another word, she turned and began to walk away, her steps steady, unhurried, and absolute. She did not look back. There was nothing left to see. The confrontation, the humiliation, the fall, it was done. She carried nothing from it, because it had never been her burden to carry. Behind her, the park resumed its rhythms, and somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the echoes of what had been, life continued as it always does, oblivious to the battles fought and the pride broken. Beneath the dappled shade of an old oak tree, the park, now washed in the amber hues of the setting sun, seemed to have reclaimed its peace. The breeze carried the soft scent of warm grass and distant blossoms, and the chatter of families, the laughter of children, and the rhythmic steps of joggers returned, blending once more into the tranquil symphony of life. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, as if memorizing the weight of what had passed. Ronda Rousey moved with the same steady, effortless grace she had shown from the beginning. Her steps, measured and unhurried, carried her away from the clearing, the confrontation, and the crowd that had begun to dissolve back into the folds of their lives. She did not glance behind her. There was no need. The chapter was closed. She had given no threat, made no demand, and yet the world had shifted around her, shaped by the simple, immovable force of her presence. The phones that had captured every second of Carlyle's fall lowered, and with them, the murmurs of the onlookers softened. Already, the first videos were scattering through the digital ether, seeds of a story that would bloom and spread far beyond the trees and pathways of the park. But Rhonda had no stake in that truth. She knew it was rarely shaped by recordings or headlines. It lived in the bones of those who witnessed it and lingered in the silence, where words held no power. The senior officer, still holding Carlyle's surrendered badge and weapon, watched her go. His lips pressed into a thin line. The lines of his face deepened with the familiar weight of choices made and consequences rendered. He had seen many things in his years behind the badge: anger, violence, injustice, and the bitter echoes of power misused. But this had not been a battle. It had been something colder, cleaner, a reckoning. He turned his eyes briefly to the crowd, noting the faces, the expressions, a tapestry of reactions ranging from awe to discomfort. Then, with a quiet authority that required no volume, he spoke to the few lingering witnesses. "That's enough. Move along." The simple command, carried on the steady current of his voice, was enough to disperse the last of the crowd. Conversations trailed off, footsteps carried people away, and soon the park resumed its normal rhythm. The spectacle faded into the folds of memory. The phones, though, would tell the story. They always did. But the truth, he knew, was something different, something felt, not filmed. In the distance, Carlyle's figure was shrinking, a silhouette against the golden haze of the evening. His steps were rigid, his back straight, in a posture that tried to hold together what had already come apart. Yet each stride seemed to carry him deeper into something he could not outrun. Pride could burn hot enough to blind, but when the fire burned out, it left only ashes. And he had felt the burn. The older officer's grip on the surrendered badge tightened briefly, then released. He felt no triumph, only the familiar cold weight of consequence. Carlyle was not the first to fall, and he would not be the last. But there was a difference between punishment and justice. The former ended with a sentence, the latter lingered, reshaping the world around it. Justice, he knew, had already spoken. Ronda, now nearing the edge of the park, slowed her steps. A few pigeons, bold and indifferent, had returned to the spot where she had sat, pecking lazily at the few remaining crumbs on the pavement. The world, it seemed, had already moved on, and so would she. She had come to the park for peace, and peace, in its way, had returned. The child's laughter, pure and free, rang out through the trees, and for the first time that day, Ronda allowed a small, fleeting smile to brush her lips. This, she thought, was the only victory that mattered, not dominance, not power, but the return of something simpler and far more valuable: stillness. With a final glance at the fading sun, she walked on, her shadow stretching long and steady across the earth behind her. The park continued, unaware that it had been a stage for something profound, a collision, not of fists, but of forces far older and deeper. And as twilight folded the day into night, the earth, the trees, and the sky bore silent witness to a truth that required no headline to endure. Power is loud, but justice is silent, and it always remains. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating content. Explore our channel for more thrilling stories and unforgettable moments. Be sure to share this video with your friends to let them experience it too. Thanks for watching.